So our goal is basically that of getting humans to the surface of Mars, keeping them there, safe, secure, productive, happy, and sane, and then ultimately to bring them home, not necessarily right away. This, in simple observation, this is a big, complicated enterprise. We have a lot of different pieces of the puzzle, different tasks to do. Some of those things have to be done before others, and some have to be. So the question is, what should be done now, especially things that people are not thinking about doing now? So what determines when do you actually tackle a given piece of a big enterprise like this? Well, there are some things that have to happen at various times, specific times, because of external functions, considerations, constraints. There's dependencies between tasks. There's some tasks just will intrinsically take a certain amount of time, like testing. If you're testing as you fly and you're going to be flying for 9 months, you test for 9 months at least. And then individual tasks are various. Some of them are big in the sense of, and some of them are hard, and there's budget constraints. So I'll go through these. So external constraints for going to Mars. The most obvious one is the Mars-Earth synodic period. Every 26 months, basically there's a bigger 15-year cycle, and so some of the every 26 months are easier than others. The Martian, and there's launch windows within every 26 months going and then coming back. The Martian year there's some interesting things there too. The atmospheric pressure drops 30% in southern winter as CO2 falls onto the ice cap, and which of course affects EDL. You don't have as much atmosphere to slow you down. There's dust storms I think it's mostly in the southern spring, and then of course the temperatures are colder when it's winter where you're going. Then there's the solar activity cycle, which principally affects the galactic cosmic radiation, during an active period of the sun, more sunspots, you have more solar flares, you have more solar particle events, but those you can mostly shield. But it turns out that reduces the galactic cosmic radiation, because it essentially increases solar wind by about 50%, as I understand it. So anyway, so those are things that are external constraints that have specific dates associated with them. Now, if we have a bunch of different tasks, some things have to be done before others. And some of these dependencies are obvious, and some of them are played up. So if we have a big rocket and we want to go on an asteroid mission, well, obviously we need to have the big rocket to go on the asteroid mission. So what you're basically saying is what we are doing now, this is used to, will enable X. But some dependencies are not obvious, and when we're talking about undertaking some function, some task in the future, there may be things that we need to be doing before we can do those, and I'll show you some of those. And that really boils into in the notion of that sometimes you need knowledge to be able to do to make decisions that allow you to go on to the next step. As I said, some activities have definite durations. Deep space habitat, you're going to use it to go to and from Mars. If you're in nominally, I don't know, like 30 plus months nominally, I guess, for a Phobos or Mars orbit, if you don't go to the surface. But the point about the deep space habitat is that it's going to be a tightly integrated system that must be highly reliable, and you don't really have the opportunity to use in situ resource utilization. Whereas on the Mars surface habitat, which you'll have at least 18 months if you're doing any sort of reasonable mission, it can be a loosely integrated system, and it should be highly repairable rather than reliable, and you can exploit ISRU. So I'm all in favor of you don't build a big tuna can, you land the tuna can, you live in the tuna can, and then you walk over to the ERV and fly home. You don't do that. What you actually create a proto base from day one, loosely integrated and highly repairable. Then of course each task in terms of development, especially some are bigger and some are harder. So I use big is the extrinsic measure in terms of software, how many lines of code, in terms of metal bending and all, and how hard is it? what are the technical challenges involved? It's an intrinsic measure. And of course, those things come together to give you a cost and a duration, and which are fuzzed by technical and schedule risks. And of course, you have the known factors, the unknown factors, the known knowns, the unknown, all those kinds of things. And of course, if the more unknowns there are, probably the earlier you should be doing that task so that you can compensate when it turns out it's either bigger or harder than you suspect. And then finally, the reason why you don't do everything all at once is because you don't have the money. And so the question is, how do you determine which things go first? It should be based on all those rational considerations. Unfortunately, sometimes it's based on historical factors and constituency issues. And sometimes you have distractions built in terms of like demonstrations of capabilities. And then finally, one reason why you might want not to tackle a given task early is maybe if you wait, you can get somebody else to do it for you. So anyway, this has all been preamble basically to what I'll be talking about now, which is the major portion of the talk, which is that first of all, it's been very clear that in the last year or so, sending humans to Mars is now becoming real in the public mind. And NASA talks about the 2040s, 2030s maybe. SpaceX, Elon is talking about 2025. But my feeling is, of course, that if we're sending humans to Mars, there's much too much focus on the two, which is the rockets, and too little on the humans and the needs of the humans. And this is pretty easy to explain because rocket launches and missions are sexy and they attract public interest, and that then develops public support. Also, rockets are expensive. The whole thing in terms of budgets and jobs, and that attracts political and management attention. So the public is more interested. Management likes to use the attention they can get that way. So anyway, to come to the nut of the talk is that there are I think that the important human-oriented issues that are not being addressed that really should be addressed now, actually 10 years ago, are the effects of Martian 3/8 gravity, the first one. The second one is the lower pressure and higher partial pressure of oxygen in the habitats. Just what is it going to be? And then there's some other considerations, but I probably won't say much about. So anyway, let's look at the NASA view of going to Mars. We have NASA's journey to Mars. Ta-da! I think it's a rule that every NASA speaker must use this chart. We have SLS and Orion. We have solar electric propulsion, the Asteroid Redirect mission. Then we have the in-space habitat, the Mars transfer spacecraft. Hey, where's the habitat on the ground? There's nothing on the ground. I suppose that they're just assuming that you'll land in your tuna can and live in your tuna can. Anyway, this is pretty graphic. Then they have their other slogan is the Evolvable Mars campaign. And let's see what we got here. Well, okay, so there's the Asteroid Redirect vehicle. I don't know what OSIRIS-REx, which is just about to launch, you go visit an asteroid. I don't know what he's doing there, since he's nothing to do with Mars. Pre-deployment of cargo, but I don't see any way of getting people. Here it is. Split versus monolithic habitat. I guess that might refer to having a separate ground thing. I'm not sure. But in any event, there's a great quote that I've used in a paper too, that someone in writing up about NASA said that you can never say that NASA has spent too much time thinking about the ground segment on a Mars program. They just never get around to it. And so I think you can say that NASA is very much front end loaded in terms of their thoughts. I mean, how do you go to Mars? You get a big rocket, you take off. Okay, so the first thing you build is a big rocket. And then eventually after you turn off the engine, you're now in a deep space habitat. Well, that happens later. We haven't done that. So anyway, so I'm going to have a few slides on some things I think are really good that are happening in the world. NASA had a site selection workshop last year. And when I saw this, and I was stupefied because I think they've made some excellent decisions here. That I've always, up until this point, it seemed to me that NASA was embarking on a replay of Apollo. You'll go here, and then next 2 years later you go there, and then on Mars. But what they were doing here was they were looking to identify candidate exploration zones. And the rules were then you'd have a nominally, I think, 100 kilometer radius. And they wanted, within the landing, you have a landing site, you have some exploration zones. You have, the overall exploration zone contains science regions of interest and also resource regions of interest. And the idea is it's going to be multiple crew visits, like nominally 5, to the same place. And what I like about this is that means it's then only a very small leap to a continuously staffed base. And one of the nice things about staying in a long time in one place and sending multiple crews to the same place is that you don't have to worry about the Mark Watney potato problem. I mean, you will pre-place enough resources to support the crew for a long time. And I'm a firm believer in optional returns. You may come back after 18 months. You may come back after 40. But probably, you can wait 26 or any number of additional 26-month cycles. Another really neat thing, I think, is supersonic retropulsion. NASA really didn't tackle supersonic retropulsion. I think they didn't have the budget to do the simulations that they would have to do before they'd be willing to do the hardware. But what their research did reveal was that supersonic parachutes really suck. They just don't work. And as I said, NASA they'd passed before on the supersonic retropulsion. But SpaceX saw supersonic retropulsion as the key to first stage recovery and reuse of their Falcon rockets. And so with the Space Act agreement, NASA had their airplanes going out and their cameras, and they said they got good data, and they shared, NASA and SpaceX shared the data. And lo and behold, it works. It turns out that that actually the firing the rockets makes a nice little bubble if you do it right. And that actually you think, oh, if you fire it to slow you down, well, actually, if your rocket is in the middle of the bottom, it doesn't. It actually doesn't slow you down, but it prevents damage. And if you put your rockets on the outside, then it does slow you down. It's complicated, but interesting. So the next step. So NASA, if you look now at all the NASA talk, NASA speak about everything. Supersonic retropulsion is the element in all their manned Mars missions. It's to get from, I don't know, Mach something down to below supersonic. So the next step is to validate it on Mars, which is the Red Dragon. And again, NASA is going to play the submission support in exchange for data. So this is allegedly going to happen in 2018. Modified Crew Dragon launching on a Falcon Heavy. Again, Elon Musk says it's not going to be just the first time, that launch window, but every one after that. So that would be in 2020, 2022, and so forth, until he gets his bigger rocket coming. And of course, NASA signed off on the data sharing and the support. Per their Space Act, they did a mod to their Space Act agreement, and NASA's going to spend about $30 million over 3 or 4 years to get the data that, as they say, 10 years earlier than they would otherwise be getting it. They had no plans for going out and getting it themselves. And from the SpaceX point of view, it's a pretty nice deal. NASA will provide deep space comms, navigation and trajectory design, EDL systems analysis and engineering support, all this good stuff. In other words, NASA is a major resource for supporting this effort. Planetary protection. This is my personal view is, I'm just pulling a number out of the air, maybe a 50% chance that they will launch in the 2018 window. Of course, the recent accident or incident makes that less likely. And then I think if they do launch, I'd say 50% chance success of actually getting the thing to land on Mars. but these are just random numbers. So, but if they don't launch in 2018, then they should launch in 2020. And if it doesn't work the first time, they should be able to try it a second time. They will. Okay, now, the interesting thing about giving this talk here today is that next Tuesday at 2:30 p.m., Elon is going to be making his presentation at the IAC, the International Astronautical Congress. It's going to be webcast. It's going to be webcast. If you go dig around, you can be able to find it. And early on, this was what his talk was going to be: a technical presentation entitled "Colonizing Mars: A Deep Technical Presentation on the Space Transport Architecture Needed to Colonize Mars." But recently, it's something like making humans a multiplanetary species. He'll discuss the long-term technical challenges, focusing on potential architectures that industry, government, and the scientific, who knows what's really going to be. But on the Mars subreddit, people have been doing Kickstarter campaigns so they could fly themselves down, get themselves to go to this thing. And the fact that it's webcast, I think, is stealing their thunder. Another positive area, I think, is Bigelow's expandable modules are great. Again, this is wonderful technology. You'd say, well, gee, if this is so good, why didn't NASA think of it? They did, of course. It's licensed from NASA, the technology. So it's good, and they may be. There's a possibility that they'll be able to attach it to the ISS. For a while on the Bigelow website, I found really cool video in which they were aiming at, hey, you little country, wouldn't you like to have your own space program? You can get 60 days of a third of a thing for a few tens of millions of dollars. And the astronauts would transfer via crew drag in there. So anyway, and then I think there's a lot of good, the piece of NASA that I think is doing good work is a lot of good work is in the mission the so-called technology mission directorate. The optical comms is important. Solar electric power is useful, will be useful for cargo only, obviously, not for things. But there's a lot. I think that there's a good portfolio going there. Meanwhile, so that's the good. Now let's go to the bad and the ugly. Space Launch System, $2 billion a year, forever. The whole purpose was Congress insisted that they do it this way to leverage the legacy stuff. And of course, it had all been, the shuttle components had all been man-rated. So they're going to reuse the solid boosters. Oh, but wait, we need a fifth segment. Now they're not man-rated anymore. You have to go back through and do that. The space shuttle main engines, you need a new controller, et cetera. And also they have like enough for 4 or 5 launches, 6 launches maybe, and then they have to restart the production line if they ever need it. And the whole idea is this is going to be the biggest rocket ever. It's going to be bigger than the Saturn V, but not the first iteration or the second iteration. It's going to be the third version will do that. So it's the Senate launch system. The Orion, they're spending $1 billion, just shy of $1 billion a year for. It's optimized for 4 crew. It can take 6, I think, in a pinch, but it's really optimized for 4. And when you consider that when Zubrin published his Mars Direct plan initially, he had crew of 4. And NASA's immediate pushback was, oh no, you have to have 6. So why are they doing it? So then they go out and they get their Orion, optimized for 4. But it does have a toilet. Hooray, okay. It uses the same Avcoat heat shield that Apollo used, but actually after the first ETF-1, it turns out that I think structurally it's not quite right, so they're having to redo that. Meanwhile, of course, what SpaceX uses is the Pika X3, I think it's now called, which is really, really cool stuff. And you'd say, well, gee, why didn't NASA think about that? Well, NASA invented it. And SpaceX licensed it from, I think it was Ames that did that. So anyway, basically, SLS and Orion, in my mind, are just basically long-term jobs programs. Texas and Alabama, and then Florida. If you look at the whole support, the thing, there's a third element. There's SLS, Orion, and then there's ground buildup, which is hundreds of millions of dollars every year at Cape Canaveral. And so basically, everybody pretends that these are needed for sending humans to Mars, they definitely would support sending humans to Mars to help. But you don't need these pieces. And the SLS is basically just too expensive to compete for other missions. Okay, now, but the thing is, NASA doesn't need Congress to do follies. We also have the, here we are, the ARM, Asteroid Redirect mission. So the Augustine Commission proposed a near-Earth object as a candidate beyond lunar destination on the so-called flexible path to Mars. The main reason, it seems to me, I'm not sure that they articulated it as explicitly, but it's a good thing when you build your deep space habitat to be able to go someplace with the deep space habitat. Okay, so the idea for when the commission said that, they envisioned going to a near-Earth asteroid using the deep space habitat, which you'd then later be using for going to Mars. But you see, now NASA feels we need to have a demonstration of the power of the SLS, and we want to make use of the Orion, and we're going to do that in the early 20s, and we won't have a deep space habitat because we haven't been developing it yet. So instead of going to the asteroid, they're going to bring the asteroid, piece of the asteroid, back to cislunar space, the robotic mission, the crew mission, and let's just spend the money. It's not a real stepping stone on the flexible path to Mars. It's an expensive detour from it, especially the robotic mission. If you want to do something useful, go collect some mini moons. You know about mini moons are these little it's very, very small asteroids, or whatever you want to call them, things the size of, from here, on bigger, are coming into not permanent, but month to year orbit around the Earth. So Earth, right now we have one big moon, permanent, but then we have a bunch of other little mini moons. I think there's they estimate there's 100 or 1,000 of the softball-sized ones at any point in time. And typically, every 6 months or so, you get a dishwasher-sized one coming. Well, why don't we develop a capability to track those well, which would be useful for tracking other things, I think, and just not bother to do that part. In fact, you could make a prize, just do a simple prize thing to have people commercially go get them. So anyway, so that's more follies. So this is the point again, the major point. What should we be doing now? When I say do this now, first thing is to assess, and I'll say some more about several of these things and why. Assess the effects of Martian 3/8 gravity physiologically, decide on the atmospheric pressure and composition for habitats, accelerate deep space habitat development, and begin some serious planning for the surface habitat so we can lead to some long-term high-fidelity simulations. I just threw this in also. We really need to make sure that by the time Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter craps out, and it's way past its lifetime, that we have something in there, because all the future stuff that we want to do depends on being able to have the MRO fly over with high rise and take a nice picture. So here's the partial gravity challenge. What we don't know, so consider one symptom, say bone muscle wasting or deterioration of vision or whatever. Over the course of some time, let's say that's 6 to 9 months, one transit time. What, 5 minutes? Okay, great. Okay, you have some bad stuff happening, and the question then is, what happens once you get back into some partial gravity? If the partial gravity, if it's 100% gravity, then on some things you'll recover, but we don't know with 3/8 gravity. Do you get better? Do you just get worse slightly? Do you get better right away? Does it take a long time, et cetera? And so that's important to know, because especially if you're thinking in terms of a colonization. And so NASA, ESA, everybody knows that this is important. We got as far as actually building, the predecessor to JAXA built such a thing, a module. It was canceled, and then now it's sitting as an exhibit in a park. Atmosphere. Why? Why on Earth is the ISS at sea level? When you get on an airplane, we go to 6,000 feet. Why not go to 6,000 feet? And so one of the major considerations is that if you want to be able to go outside, then you want to minimize the risk of bends. But you want higher percentage of oxygen, lower pressure in your habitat. And so the thing looks something like this. You have, here's sea level in the shuttle or the ISS. Here's Denver. Here's this airliner cabin. I say we build a nice test site at Pikes Peak and do some research there. This is what I've been thinking about as a habitat. Okay, so so that's the atmosphere. That's the gravity, the atmosphere. We really want to start developing the deep space hab because it represents a huge leap in terms of size and duration beyond what we have on our experience with. So if you have 4 to 6 people for 180 to 270 days, you're talking about 700 to 1,600 person. I'm using the person day as a measure of the size of the problem. For comparison, Apollo did about 30. ISS, you have a bunch of different launches. And so the idea is that we have no experience in anything like the scope of what we will need to go to Mars, especially with the Mars Colonial Transporter. Okay, so the last point is, I think, a major thing I want to talk about very briefly is we need to do simulations on the surface. We can do simulations of being on the surface of Mars here on Earth, where it's less expensive. What we can't do is partial gravity. But everything else we can and should be doing. And the sequence of, you can start with the habitat and you add in all these various things till you get out, you have a really big outdoors and you have a good time with that. And you should keep doing it for quite a while. So being in the habitat is important. There's a lot of stuff to do inside the habitat. Our lessons from the quest to the South Pole, basically, Amundsen leveraged into it. We need to create Martians here on Earth to learn how to do this stuff. And as Amundsen, there's a Scandinavian saying, "There's no such thing as bad weather, only bad clothing." So we need to be smart about that. So the very last point is that to go back to the point of that sometimes there's these external constraints on when you can do things. We have specific launch windows for going to Mars. We have a bunch of different tasks to end up with launching the first crew. If you were Elon and you want to launch here to get to 2025, then you don't have any time to do the other things. I mean, it's already too late. And finally, that's something. So this is the last 2 slides. Final thoughts about NASA. The 2030s is a reasonable time frame for getting there, but only if we change priorities. We need less SLS, Orion, and ARM. We need more of the studies of the gravity, and we need to decide on the habitat atmosphere. We need to do these other things, and we have to replace the MRO because if we have a gap in that kind of coverage, you can't do anything. And the very last thing, SpaceX, 2025 is not going to happen, but it's a useful target. There's a lot of good stuff happening, and the question is, what will Elon say at next week's IAC? And hopefully he'll use the word cyclers. Anyway, that's it. Thank you very much. Okay. Yes, sir. Hello. Yes, sir.
First recommendation is to cancel everything that's existing and start some new ones.
No. Okay.
You want to slow down the 3 existing programs.
Okay. I want to cancel ARM because that doesn't contribute everything.
You're wrong about that.
Okay.
So you want to cancel 3 existing programs and start over. You want to see how that is.
It depends if you want to leverage what Elon Musk is going to be doing, and Jeff and Bezos. Yeah, basically. Yeah. That's kind of. I don't think that's going to happen. I'm not saying it's going to happen. No, it's not going to happen. But yeah,
It's
okay.
a nice wish.
Yeah. And but ARM, I think is anyway. Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah. And maybe one last. No. Okay. Yes, sir. Rob.
You know, you can study 3D gravity. We have the biosatellite, Mars gravity biosatellite in the wings ready to go.
Okay.
Parked outside the space station. That study of 3D gravity is ready to go. So it was done 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's at least one thing on this chart. It's very easy to accommodate.
Yeah.
Very important.
Yeah.
It still sits in flux.
Yeah. I had lunch with John Charles, the guy from the space medicine guy from Johnson, and he said, well, yeah, we'd love, we really need to do 3/8, but we can't do that. So the strategy really is to just get 0G experience out to the full length, the 30-month plus the whole thing, and then you know you can't be any worse than that. That was, again, we don't have the money, or it's not doable. Anyway.
At least he says he doesn't have the money as opposed to.
Yeah. He didn't say it wasn't useful.
He didn't say he
Yeah.
didn't know how.
Yeah.
Is he aware of Mars gravity?
I don't know. Yeah.
What do you think about using the Bigelow expandable, like one of the big i330 modules,
Yeah.
one of those for use by stuff?
Yeah, I have a slide on that. Yeah, but yes, that's absolutely. Bigelow is one of the good things. Yeah, with some of that good NASA technology, just like the Pika X. Good NASA technology. Yeah, good. Okay.